Alright, let me get you some psychedelic thing to look at, because this is going to be more of a podcasty type thing, so enjoy the old Windows 98 maze, because I'm not going to be playing anything today. Thought about doing this as a console tier list, but I think I might just do that in another video. Anyways, I've seen some people do some retrospective videos of their gaming experiences, history, and since I'm not quite middle-aged, but I'm getting there, and I got some changes in my life coming up, I thought it's probably about time to do mine, because gaming is in a weird spot now, as it is. Anyways, my first gaming experiences were actually not like traditional video games. I was probably about late 5, almost 6 when I actually got my first console. But the first games I played, unless we're counting some like really old and really simple, like my grandma's old or grandma and grandpa's old freaking pre-Windows computer that were like the most basic edutainment things you could possibly think of. Unless we're counting those, my first real experiences were pinball, actually, of all things, if we're counting that too, which I think it kind of does. I mean, it's not a video game, but it is electronic entertainment in a similar vein. My dad taught me how to play pinball at the pizza place we used to go to, which was a local place, not like a chain. And I want to say I was probably like maybe 3 when he did. But anyways, he taught me how to play pinball at the pizza place, and we used to get pizzas like almost every Friday. Like Friday was pizza night, and that would be followed up by going to like Blockbuster or Hollywood Video. Hands up for anyone who actually knows what those places are and been to them. But usually what it would take about, I don't know, 20 or 30 minutes for the thing to be made. So I'd go back in the arcade room and play either the pinball or the arcade games while it was being made. And I want to say my first actual arcade game after I learned how to play pinball was Moon Patrol? Man, it's been so long, and obviously since I'm older, my memories aren't exactly vivid, but I'm pretty sure it was like Moon Patrol, because that's like the first game I actually remember playing and liking, and be like, ooh, give me a quarter so I can go play Moon Patrol every Friday. Granted, that's not the only game I played, but I do seem to remember that was probably the first. Now, I have played some other games they had at the said parlor, some Lycan games, some Asteroids clones, but I've never actually played any Atari games, so I'm not going to go into those. Like, I've played games that were ported to the Atari. Like, I played, like, different variations, either as a compilation or occasionally on, like, an actual arcade cabinet of things like Asteroids, and Battlezone, and Missile Command. Because I know my dad used to have a compilation of 3 Atari games. It's like Centipede, I think Asteroids, and Missile Command on the Sega Genesis we had, but that's getting a bit ahead of things. Anyways, probably when I was 5, early 5, I got put in this No, actually I take that back. I was 4 when this happened, because I also remember my preschool having another system. But anyways, when I was 4, my first home console experience was the NES. I never owned an NES, but I did play it more than a few times at said daycare. They didn't have a lot of games. I know they had Super Mario Bros. 1 and 2, the Zelda games, Contra 1 of all things, and a couple other things. I did get to play Super Mario Bros. 3. It's like somebody donated or something, like right before I got taken out of said daycare. But anyways, I'm saying this because I don't have a huge nostalgia boner for the NES. even though that was my first experience. I do like some NES games that are true classics, like said Mario games. I guess maybe Zelda, although I'm not really particularly big on the NES Zeldas. You know, the Mega Man games are pretty good, but I didn't play those until far later in my gaming quote-unquote career. But there was quite a bit of crap on the NES. Let's not kid ourselves. Now, to be fair, this was back in the day when there weren't any standards, and we were coming off the video game crash, or at least the US was. And sure, the NES did have some genre-defying moments, like Super Mario Bros. Essentially creating truly the platform genre and taking it away from these arcade experiences that era was known for, where you play the game for 10 minutes and you've seen pretty much all the game has to offer, except for just getting a little bit harder as you go. The score attack kind of things, which I was never big on, because, yeah, again, I like playing Moon Patrol in the arcade while waiting for a pizza, but that's like 20 or 30 minutes a week. That's not like something I'd want to buy and sit down and play. Maybe that's because, again, I grew up on the era when games were moving away from that, so take that as you will. But anyways, for a very brief time, the preschool I was sent to got a Sega Master System up and running. I did not care for that system. Granted, I only played it like twice. I don't even remember what games we played. But I've tried some other Master Systems over the years. And apart from like the Sonic games, which are, I think everyone will agree, are inferior to the Genesis ones, and most of them are either copies or ports of the Game Gear games, which my experience of what those games are on the Game Gear, not the Master System. And maybe the Wonder Boy games, but that's about it. The Master System was not good. Let's not kid ourselves. Yeah, the 8-bit era was pretty rough, and apart from the few games I was exposed to, it just wasn't a big part of my life. So it's harder to look past the fact that there's quite a bit of stinkers in that era. But it was genre and defying, and it was a big step up for the industry. I won't knock it for that. When I became a gamer, however, was when I was on my 5th Christmas, a few months before my birthday. I got a Sega Genesis. And for context, I had asked for this because right before I'd been taken out of that daycare I mentioned, they finally let us play the Sega Genesis that belonged to the kid of the person who ran that daycare. I only ever got to play like one game on that, and that was Sonic 2. Actually, I take that back. I think we did get to play Sonic 1 as well, but Sonic 1 and 2, that was it. Those were the only Genesis games I'd ever played before then. And when I did play those games, I fell in love with the system. I don't know, maybe it was because of the speed or the fact that it was like way better looking at the time. And I guess Sonic 2 was just, as a 5-year-old, was far more fun to play because it wasn't as punishing. Certainly challenging for a kid, but not as punishing as, say, Super Mario Bros. But anyways, I got that system, and I got it with Sonic 2, Sonic Spinball, and Aladdin of all things. Which, man, that was a tedious game. Fun, but man, was it hard. Anyways, from that point on, I started slowly getting games. But, me being a dumb kid who can't make money, most of my games were Christmas or birthday gifts, or just random things I picked up. Most of my playing different games during that era, was renting games, because again, I did mention we did go to Blockbuster on Friday, so, I rent a game over the weekend, and that's how I got to play a lot of other games that I didn't have, because again, I did not have very many games. Oh, yes, the add-ons before I get into that, I did not have either of well, actually, no, I didn't. I never had a Sega CD, but I did have a 32X, like, far past the end of its life, because I wanted to play Knuckles Chaotix, and I didn't know about emulation back then. But anyways, the point I'm trying to make is I was a Sega Genesis kid through and through. Now, I did have an SNES for a brief time, a couple of years. And that was mostly because I wanted to play Super Mario World. And that was a game I did get to play at a friend's house a couple of times, which I really enjoyed the game. But I wasn't super big on the SNES physical games until I'd gotten into emulation, in which case, man, did I have a plethora of games I wanted to try. But, anyways, between, maybe it's nostalgia talking, or maybe it's just because that was just most of where my early experience came from, but I'm still of the opinion of, between the two, the Sega Genesis was the better system. Now, I will fully admit the SNES did have a better variety of games, and probably more exclusives. But the thing is, most of the multiplats are honestly better on the Genesis. Maybe it's because I prefer the Genesis sound chip as a part of it. I like that metal sound device it had compared to the more bland thing the SNES produced. The SNES certainly had better on the sound effects for the most part, although I think Sega games did have more clarity on their sound effects. But I don't know, a lot of the SNES soundtracks were sounded kind of washed out. And back then I was like kind of big on video game soundtracks. I still am, but you know, after hearing things like the Sonic games soundtracks, like I guess I just kind of fell in love with VGM at that point. So again, if you want to accuse me of being biased, go ahead. I'll accept it. But between the exclusives it had and the fact that most multiplats are better on it, I just think the Genesis is the better system. A lot of games ran better on the Genesis as well. Like, I did notice more slowdowns in SNES games. That being said, the SNES did have a couple big wins. One of which was Mode 7, which gave you things like Mario Kart, as well as the Super FX chip, which wasn't really used much, but it was pretty impressive when it was. Like, I remember, I never owned Star Fox, but I did play it at a demo station at like maybe Walmart or something, or Target. And I thought that was pretty freaking cool. Like, now the Genesis did get some pseudo 3D stuff for the 32X, or even for the base system itself, but man, did they run poorly. I remember when my dad picked up Virtual Racing, of all things, and holy crap, that had to be like a single-digit frame rate. Meanwhile, you can play Mario Kart in the SNES pretty smoothly. Wasn't fully 3D, but, you know, it was what it was. It looked and played better than freaking Virtual Racing. So, for that area, my win will always go to the Genesis. Hell, the first video game I ever actually beat was on the Genesis. Like, I used to be pretty bad at video games, even with the arcade experience I had. Like, my dad used to be able to get farther than me in Sonic 2. Like, I used to get stuck at Casino Night stage, which is the 4th stage into the game. My dad probably was able to get to around Mystic Cave, which is the 6th stage, I think. But the first game I actually beat was Sonic 3. And I have to go on a bit of a side tangent on this when I do the console review section, as well as I want to do a Sonic tier list as well. But the fact that that was one game split into two, I did not realize that point of why Sonic 3 was like so much easier than, say, 2. Because, oh, the damn game was split into 2 games. But it was the funniest thing. I want to say I was 7 when that game came out, or when I had it. But it was the funniest thing. I beat the final boss after multiple attempts. I don't want to say like I did it in one go. I did not. It took me many attempts to be able to get that far. And that armed final boss kicked my ass as a kid. I can beat it pretty easily now, but back then, that shit was hard. Anyways, when I beat the game, the credits started rolling, and I was like, what the hell is this? Because, you know, the game was short and easy. And I'm just sitting there watching the credits and like, is the rest of the game going to show up? What's going on here? Because I didn't really know what credits were, because I was trained to just stop watching a movie when the credits started rolling as a kid and just, eject the tape, re-roll it, or get out of the theater. And so when the end screen finally hit, I'm just like, was that really the whole game? And then I was just like, wait a minute, that means I beat the game. Holy shit. So that motivated me to finally go back and beat Sonic 2, and beat it I did. And from there, I started working my way to grinding my way through certain games that I had never been able to beat. Sonic 1, I think I'm pretty sure I beat Sonic 1 after 2. Sonic and Knuckles, I rented that one. I had to rent that one a couple of times to beat it, but I ended up beating that one. Both standalone and lock-on. I have no idea what else I beat. After that point, I didn't beat Sonic Spinball for quite a while, because that fourth table, oof, that one's hard. Anyway, this is supposed to be a rant on my gaming retrospective, not Sonic, so I'll move away from that. But SNES was a great system, but sorry, the Genesis will always be it for me. Now moving on to the add-ons, I did play the CD at a friend's house. I mostly only played it to play Sonic CD. And then he also introduced me to Sewer Shark, which I think came with the system of all things. Who keeps pinging me? I'll have to look at that later. But the main thing I had was the 32X, and I only had 2 games for that. Knuckles Chaotix and Star Wars Arcade, which I'm convinced are the only 2 games worth of that system that are worth playing, apart from maybe a few enhanced ports. Like, Virtual Racing was definitely better on the 32X than it was on the Genesis, but that was still pretty bad. So, yeah, we all know those 2 add-ons are a flop, and honestly, Sega probably would have been in a far better position if they hadn't invested into that, at least not in the 32X, especially. Now, the Sega Saturn, I never owned. I only know 2 people that ever owned it. And both of them only had a couple of games. The only ones I ever tried was the Saturn version of Sonic 3D Blast, which I will say I prefer the Genesis version, mostly because of the soundtrack. I'm sorry, but the Saturn one has better clarity, but it just doesn't fit at all. This Genesis version is just so much better. And apart from that, it was just the museum mode for Sonic Jam and Bug, of all things. That's about it. Both kids I knew only had like 3 or 4 games for the system. And I'm kind of glad that I never pushed for owning it, because that Sonic game that we were all waiting for never came out. And honestly, the biggest things that killed it were half the damn games never came out of Japan. Probably even more than half. Plus the fact that, its price point was not good. Because no kid was going to be able to afford it, so you pretty much had to, hope your parents had enough money to buy the damn thing for you. Ugh. I don't know what they were thinking with that. They botched that launch so hard and it completely killed the system, and honestly kind of killed Sega as a console competitor. Now, before we move on to the next generation, I'm going to talk a bit about handhelds. I never had an original Game Boy. I did have a Game Boy Color later in its lifespan, but that was mostly to play Pokemon and the Zelda games. Now, being a Genesis kid, I of course had to go for the freaking Game Gear, and that ended up being a mistake because its library was pretty piss poor. It had some of the Sonic games were good, though they were a step down. As I said, they were a step down from the Genesis games. I had maybe a couple other ones. Like I had a baseball game that came with the system, was okay. But most of it were just Master System ports. Or dumbed down versions of Genesis games. And to top it all off, the battery. Holy shit. I want to say it was like 4 to 6, it was either 4 or 6 double A's, and you got like 2 or 3 hours of battery left on that thing before it died. Why did I have that system? Well, I saw the commercial for it, and I don't know if anybody saw or remembers this, but it was the funniest thing. It was this commercial of this dog glancing between the Game Gear and the Game Boy lying on the ground, and the Game Boy was just a monochrome oversimplification of Tetris playing, and then it would show the Genesis playing the Sonic games, and to go back to the monochrome Tetris, and like go back to the Sonic games. Like, all right, I'm a dumbass kid. I'm immediately gonna fall for the Genesis or the Game Boy because, you know, Genesis kid plus those games actually look fun. I couldn't care less about Tetris. I don't like Tetris style block falling puzzle games or line clearing games. And yeah, lesson learned: never fall for marketing, because if I had gone with the Game Boy, I could have at least gotten Super Mario Land, and then I would have been prepared for Pokemon and the Zelda games. Of course, I don't think the Game Boy's library was particularly good either, but it was better than the Game Gear's. Anyways, my mom bought that for me because I had to be dragged to a business meeting, and that was several hours long, and I specifically remember being bored through half of that because the damn batteries died on me halfway through it. So yeah, that sucked. Game Gear was not particularly good. Anyways, when I had a Game Boy Color, it was probably, I don't know, a year after Pokemon came out. That was also a Christmas gift. I did not have a huge library for it, but I probably had more than I did for the Game Gear. Anyways, back to consoles. So a store had opened up about a block down from where I lived at this mini mall. Or mini strip mall. And it was a game exchange. And they, unlike Blockbuster, rented consoles out. And this was around the time when the N64 had came out. I had played it once at a friend's house because their cousins had brought it over. Or, yeah, I think his cousins had brought it over. So I got to try a little bit of Super Mario 64, Wave Race, and multiplayer GoldenEye. So, that wasn't quite when the thing came out. But anyways, I had rented it. I had rented the system because I wanted to try Shadows of the Empire. Because this was around the time when shortly after I'd been introduced to Star Wars. Because I did not grow up on the movies. I grew up on the games. But that's actually a discussion for later. But for now, back to the N64. I had rented it, I had enjoyed it, and it's like, holy crap. These 3D games are awesome. Because, you know, Mario 64 was a banger. GoldenEye was pretty interesting. Because I had not really... The only other shooter I had ever tried was Dark Forces. And Wave Race I didn't particularly care for, but it was still cool to look at. But anyways, I rented that system a couple of times, and I was like, alright. I was also interested in the PlayStation, but not so much. Like, alright, I want a 3D system. Though I specifically remember saying, I want this in 64. My parents, for whatever reason, ended up picking me up a PlayStation, along with Crash Bandicoot and the second shooter I'd ever really played, which is called DEFCON 1. Or, sorry, DEFCON 5. And I use shooter very loosely on that game. Because that game was a very odd mishmash up. But anyways, I remember getting pretty disappointed that I didn't get the 64. You know, being the fact that I was a kid, of course I had to be a bit of a brat over it. Not huge brat over it. I wasn't like tearing up or throwing a hissy fit. But I did question, it's like, why did I get a PlayStation? I wanted the 64. But going past that probably ended up being a good thing, because I got introduced to a lot of new series that I probably otherwise wouldn't have if I had just gotten the 64 and never touched a PlayStation. Because I grew pretty fond of Crash Bandicoot. Later on, I get introduced to Oddworld of all things by another friend. Resident Evil, also by said friend, which, yes, I was probably too young to play, but I didn't give a crap. can't think of any off the top of my head that I played shortly after the launch. Or, not the launch, when I got it. But I did get into some... that through renting games, I also brought in my horizons, because I did start growing on flight sims as well, or space sims as well, because between the X-Wing games and playing Colony Wars on the PlayStation, space sims definitely, I grew on them. There were a couple other 3D platformers I grew to like Gex Into the Gecko. Definitely discount we have Mario 64 at home, but it was pretty cool for the time. But then, anyways, the next year I got my 64, and with that I got Ocarina of Time, which had just come out, and GoldenEye. Now, you may be asking, what about Mario 64? Well, I actually rented that game a couple times to beat it that way. I never actually owned Mario 64. I loved the damn game to death, but I never actually owned it. Don't ask why, I just never picked it up. It wasn't that high of a priority for me. But shortly after, I also got Mario Kart 64 from my grandparents as a Christmas gift, and then I bought Star Fox for like $30 used. At least I think it was used. From like, maybe that Game Exchange? Or maybe it was like at a used sale at a Blockbuster, I don't remember. But those 4 games were pretty much the defining moments of when I'd gotten into picked up the 64 and gotten into it. Because by that time, we had actually picked up a PC, and I had Shadows of the Empire on the PC, as well as a flight stick. Which, again, that's how I'd also gotten into Star Wars from those said games, because when we picked up said PC, I had gotten this LucasArts compilation of a bunch of different Star Wars games. And like I said before, my first FPS wasn't GoldenEye, it was Dark Forces, which was in that set. Or at least it was a 3-level demo of it. I didn't play the full version until I picked up the PlayStation game like a year later. But anyways, GoldenEye is what really got me into first-person shooters. Ocarina of Time got me into Zelda because, again, my only experience was the NES game, which I didn't particularly care for. And man, it got me into it hard because I effing loved that game. And I will get into that when I do a Zelda tier list, but I spent quite a long time learning and playing that game because I hadn't really had much experience in adventure games or action adventure games at that time. So, as you can probably guess for anyone who's played it took me quite a while just to get out of the damn forest. But I slowly grounded my way through that game. It took me months to finally beat it, and boy, was I a happy clam when I finally did. Because even though I did eventually get a strategy guide for it, I didn't abuse it too much. Most of the time, I figured things out for myself. The biggest thing I used it for was that damn water temple, and I don't think anyone will blame me for that. Like for real, is anybody gonna blame me for that? Yeah, I didn't think so. But anyways, I did pick up some other N64 games that I grew particularly fond of. I didn't actually get to play Majora's Mask or Perfect Dark until quite later when I picked up the expansion pack, and by then the GameCube was either out or almost out. I can't think of any things I picked up that really floored me on the N64. I know there were some, but again, those 4 games were like the big ones. But I ended up having a larger library for the PlayStation for the 64, because most of the time when there was a multiplat, I went for the PlayStation version because it was cheaper, and it usually had a better soundtrack. Plus, back then, FMVs were becoming a thing, and, that was me being wowed by the next big thing. So, video game cutscenes, always pretty cool. Plus, the fact that PS games had voice actings, most of the 64 games outside of Perfect Dark, Mega Man 64, and a couple other ones did not have voice acting, or if they did, it was just little tiny sound bits, like the death cries from GoldenEye, or the random things Mario said when jumping. But yeah, I ended up with a larger library for the PlayStation, but of the exclusives and the games I had for the 64 were some really unique and eye-opening experiences for me. So if you're gonna ask me, since you had both of those systems more or less pretty early on, and while you had a quicker lead from the PlayStation off than the 64, which one would you say was better? I honestly would be hard-pressed to answer that. I will say, most PlayStation games have aged better because they weren't as heavily polygonal as the 64. And like I said before, they had better sound chips in them. Mostly because they were CD. And PlayStation did have a larger library of games, but it had a lot more shovelware. Or games that were just plain bad. The N64 had less games. They were more expensive and harder to come by, but there were so many holy shit and genre-defying games for it, like Mario 64, GoldenEye. GoldenEye, man, that game has aged so badly. It's not even funny, but for those who are around, probably know why that was such a big deal for console. And keyword I say console shooters, because before then, most console shooters were Doom clones. PC was making strides, sure, but I wasn't as heavily into PC as I am now, and a lot of those early games I had missed, because, again, I didn't play Doom probably until I was an adult. Or at least until Doom 3 came out. I don't remember which. So, I gotta give it to the 64. Like, the PlayStation was the better console, sure. Even though it was less powerful. But, and it had more games, but the 64 was just so memorable. They're both great systems, but again, this is like you putting a gun to my head and saying pick one. I'd probably go with the 64 this time. Now, I guess I could touch briefly on the Game Boy Advance. This is probably the first one I picked up with my own money. And I did pick it up partially because backwards compatibility, because at the time, the only game I was particularly interested in was Mario Kart Super Circuit. And I had quite a bit of fun with that game. I think that game was really underrated. Of course, that's also playing in single player because I didn't have a link cable and I didn't know anybody else who had it, but I had fun with it. But I did slowly grow my library on that thing. Advance Wars ended up being a banger, which I picked up after trying it on the emulator. Honestly, a lot of the games I had on the Game Boy Advance I tried before I played them on the emulator, and if I liked it, I bought it. If I didn't, I didn't. But it was a pretty good system, very short-lived. Had a surprisingly large and good library for how short its lifespan was. Definitely better than the Game Boy, I can say that much. Sure, the Game Boy might have had more games, but like quality-wise, the GBA was where it was at. And honestly, just like from quality perspective, I think the Game Boy was probably the best from pure game quality. Because yeah, it had its shovelware, but the DS was loaded with shovelware. The 3DS, like, its library suffered quantity-wise, and the Game Boy just had a lot of NES-like crap. Like, games that were either ports of NES games or they were very similar in just how similar they were. Like, I get it. The system was basically just a portable NES, much like how the Game Boy was a portable Master System. But that doesn't excuse the fact that there were just a lot of bad games for it. So I quite enjoyed my time with the Game Boy Advance, and I won't say it's my favorite system because I think the 3DS has that one because I actually do like the 3D effect. It doesn't give me a headache, and guess what? I hacked my 3DS, and I've got the entirety of the Nintendo handheld library on my fingertips, including the Virtual Boy, because there's now an emulator for that will have 3D effect. And for DS games, the bootstrap compatibility is a hell of a lot better than it used to be and almost completely playable. And there's also the flashcard option, which I did pick up. I want to say like 5 or 6 years ago. Probably, maybe not that far back. Which I always use for all my DS purposes. So, you know, utility-wise, the 3DS has it, but for sheer quality, I think the Game Boy Advance was their best one. Certainly may not say that way from sales, because we all know the DS won that one, but there were reasons for it. Now, for the next generation of consoles, being the fact that I was coming off the N64, and the fact that there are some, like, really cool games for it that a friend had and showed me, like, well, to be fair, some of them were multi-plat, but most multi-plats are better on the GameCube or the Xbox, because, let's be real, the PlayStation 2 was weak. And half the reason I even picked up the PS2 later on was for Time Crisis, because I actually did have a light gun for that thing. Anyways, so I picked that up. I played through Melee. We played Melee quite a bit. There are a couple other shooters he had. But when I finally got that thing for Christmas, I got Melee, 007 Agent Under Fire, and then later on, when I went to the store to spend my Christmas money, I picked up Nightfire, a helicopter game, which that one ended up being a mistake. And I think that was it, initially. But anyway, oh wait, I also got Medal of Honor Frontline. And that game was an experience. That game was actually what got me into World War II shooters. Because I actually did play the original Medal of Honor on the PlayStation, but it wasn't... It was decent, but Frontline just kind of floored me. Anyways, I actually, for a while, was mostly accumulating stuff on the GameCube, slowly. Even when I got a PS2, because I think I got the PS2 a year later for Christmas, or 2 years later. But, of course, as anyone who is familiar with the PS2's library, that ended up changing, because I'm turning around and looking back at my game collection, and the only thing that's going to rival my PS2 game collection is going to be the Switch. But, to be fair, a big part of that was because the PS2 won, because A, it was a cheap DVD player. They kind of cheated with this thing. It was the cheapest DVD player you could find, but more importantly, it won the Japanese support lottery. Especially when it came to JRPGs. Because, you know, Final Fantasy X being a PS exclusive, yeah, that did not help the GameCube, or the Xbox for that matter. Water. Anyways, I still feel that system won that generation and won its all-time highest-selling console unfairly, because, let's be real, it was pretty weak. It had a lot of shovelware. Most of its multiplats, it was the worst version you could get. And a lot of its Western exclusives were not particularly good. Again, it mostly won because it won the Japanese lottery. There are some decent Western games on it, don't get me wrong. But I don't think that's why anybody was going out and buying it. Because if you're just going to play Western games, you're probably getting it on the PC or picking up an Xbox. And speaking of the Xbox, I didn't get that one until like shortly before the 360 came out. And that was mostly because the 360 was reported to not either have limited or no backwards compatibility. Unlike the PS2, which had PS1 support, which I actually did really appreciate, by the way. Because my PS1 ended up having serious problems a few years into when I had the PS2. If not, actually, I think it had having serious problems when I got the damn PS2. But anyways, I ended up trashing that thing because it was just gone. Or the PS1, I mean. Anyways, yeah, that Xbox. I mostly picked it up because I was interested in the Mech Assault games and the Halo games, which that ended up being a bit of a disappointment because I always heard that game lauded as the greatest thing. Well, yeah, it did It did do some creative things for console shooters. Uh, Halo 1 was not that good. I'm sorry. The campaign was decent up until the library, in which case it completely shat itself out. And the multiplayer was fun, but it was nothing special. It basically popularized using twin sticks for aiming and moving, which not really fair because there were games that did it before it. Maybe not as good, but they did do it before it. And it introduced regenerating health, and oh boy, was that a mistake. Sure, regenerating health does work for some games like Call of Duty, but for the most part, it really hurt the shooter genre for quite a while. Because let's be fair, I think segmented regenerating health is fine. Like, you know, in the original Resistance Fall of Man or Medal of Honor Airborne, where you had your health bar separated into segments, and as long as that segment wasn't completely depleted, you could regenerate that health. But if it was, then you had to find a health pack to heal it. I think that was a good grounds between the two, and I don't know why it's not used more. But yeah, I did not have that many Xbox games, original Xbox games, and most of them were either exclusive or there was something special about the Xbox port. Oh yeah, and Oddworld Munch's Odyssey was the other one, because again, I loved the first two Oddworld games. That game ended up being a disappointment, but it was still pretty alright. I did ask for the 360 because by then, I did not have a computer that was... I had a Windows 98 computer. That's how old it was. So, like, games that were coming out for it, like Quake 4, I flat out couldn't play, and I wanted to. So I had actually asked for the 360, and instead of getting that, that's when my parents got me, like, a more modernized computer. And I could finally start playing newer games. That was nice. And before you're asking, I forgot to mention, I actually did buy the original Xbox used from GameStop for like $100. Don't do that. Don't do that, because I was having problems with it. And I have a video on my channel, a short of a bug the thing later developed, where it was like the disk drive just went haywire. So yeah, don't ever buy a used console from GameStop. Just don't. Lesson freaking learned. So I was actually pretty heavily on the PC for quite a while after that, because again, I could start catching up on games I had missed. Now after that, I had asked for the Wii, but my parents weren't able to get one because we all know how well that thing sold. Oh, wait, I'm skipping something. So, you're going to ask me, like, what was the best system from that generation? From the previous generation. My answer is going to be GameCube. Library was hurt for a number of things, including its disk drive or mini disc issues, making developers either skip it or just reluctantly putting out a 2-disc version because of the file size limit. But its library was mostly quality. It had the least amount of shovelware of the 3 systems. There were some great Nintendo games, although some of them did end up having to grow on me later. Like, I was not particularly huge on Wind Waker or Sunshine when they first came out, but they did grow on me. And then, you know, you had Luigi's Mansion, the Star Wars games, or the Rogue Squadron games more specifically. So that one definitely won with exclusives that weren't JRPGs. But unfortunately, it just did not have as many exclusives to play PS2, and just that controller. I think most of us who used it can agree it had one of the best controllers. It's just my experience with the GameCube was just top tier compared to the other two, even if the PS2 did win from a sheer games perspective. But yeah, Xbox was the only one I'd really say, you don't really need to play it. Unless you just really want to play the exclusives it still has, and aren't backwards compatible on the Series X/Bone. Next up is actually the DS. I did get that for my birthday, I want to say a year before the Wii came out. Probably sooner than that. I don't remember, but it was shortly after its launch because I remember the only game I got with it was Mario 64. Yeah, the first time I finally owned that game was the freaking port of Mario 64, well, remake. And that ended up... I had mixed feelings about that one. Yeah, it was nice to have it, and I do like the new content, but some of the content was just being changed was not good. I am not particularly fond of that port. And I don't think it was until Advance Wars Dual Strike came out where I finally started actually getting DS games I wanted. But I had a pretty big DS library. I don't have too many complaints with the system. My only issues were the games that force you to use touchscreen, and I'm going to be a very big hypocrite about this later when I talk about motion controls, but I am not fond of forced touchscreen controls because, number one, they're even more imprecise than the motion controls. Two, I always feel like I'm scratching the shit out of my screen, which I hate. And honestly, you kind of do scratch it unless you're using your thumb, which, hey, enjoy fingerprints. And a lot of them are just counterintuitive. Just the way you hold the DS and the stylus is kind of uncomfortable at times. But yeah, it had a lot of good games. I have a lot of fond memories for it. Had a lot of shovelware too. Because I'm pretty sure that's when the Touch Generations moniker started. And now, that one I do have something to compare it to, which is the PSP. I picked this one up around the time I was going to get a Wii because I was like, alright, the Wii is impossible to find because my parents weren't able to get it. So they gave me the money that they were going to use to buy it. So I ended up buying a PSP instead. And I had some good times with the PSP. The Mega Man remakes were great. Especially the Mega Man 1 one. There were some JRPG ports and remakes that I got into. A couple of shooters that were surprisingly competent on the PSP. But my library for it was not that big. I think I had maybe like one stack of games worth. My most memorable thing were like memorable times with it were those said JRPGs plus the Mega Man games. Not particularly the shooters or the Western games it got because support for it was not particularly good. And honestly, even though it was more powerful, I think I prefer the DS's visuals to it. I don't know, the PSP just always seemed too grainy. But yeah, I think most of us can agree that the DS was the clear winner in almost every aspect compared to the PSP. Like, I enjoyed my time with the PSP. It had some good games, but yeah, it was not going to compete with the DS in any way, shape, or form. And I remember all the Sony fanboys saying, "Oh, this is going to win. Look how powerful it is." Like, you also said that with the Vita, and look how that one turned out. Yeah, I'm going to say this right now. I do not care for fanboys. Anyways, so the next generation, as I was about to say, I started with the Wii. And this, I actually am going to detract from the popular opinion of all those detractors that were afraid of losing their elite thumbstick skills to the motion controls, which I honestly think that's why so many people detracted from it. Or at least I used to. Now looking back and having played games in VR and with gyro, I will admit that the motion controls, the tracking on them were not that good, especially with the nunchuck. The nunchuck's controls were terrible. When I first got the Wii, all I had was Wii Sports and Call of Duty 3. And while Wii Sports was fine, it actually showcased the system quite well. Even despite what it was, just a short minigame compilation. Call of Duty 3, on the other hand, had some issues. Aiming with the IR sensor was excellent, and the closest you can get to the mouse and keyboard. I do not understand why that didn't become the norm. And there were other shooters that did do that, like Resident Evil 4 Wii Edition, or the Medal of Honor games, or the later Call of Duty games. Aiming with that thing, excellent once you learn how to do it, and immersive. The problem was the waggle gimmicks for games that didn't use the motion controls properly, which, for example, the QuickTime events in Resident Evil 4. Frickin' Waggles. Why are we doing this? They're stupid. And they turned a lot of people off to the motion controls. Which I don't blame them for not liking that. Waggles are stupid. But again, once implemented properly, they worked quite well. And they made a lot of games more immersive. And they paved the way to VR becoming a thing. And there's a ton of great games on the Wii. Yes, there's a lot of shovelware. Quite a bit of shovelware because of its popularity with the casual crowd. But for the games that are actually, meant to be games, like Super Mario Galaxy, the shooters I mentioned, quite a bit of the other Nintendo games, most of them were pretty good. Like, Super Smash Bros. Brawl. Hell, that one even gave the concession of playing with the Wiimote or plugging in a GameCube controller. Which is another great thing about the Wii, it was backwards compatible with the GameCube. I appreciated that. Now, the next one I bought was I actually bought the Wii when I was working my first job as a junior tax preparer of all things. Don't question how I got that job. But I actually did have to take a certification course for it. I was in my 20s, so it's not like I was a little kid. Excuse me. The second one I bought was the PS3, which I actually hurried to buy because they were phasing it out with the 40 gig and the 80 gig model, which were not fully backwards compatible. And since my PS2 was having problems, it's like, alright, I need to buy this now and get it. And, that was a bit of an experience with that system. The only game I bought with it when I first got it was Resistance, which was an alright game. Not great, but it was pretty good. And I slowly started accumulating games, mostly for multiplats that weren't on the Wii and the Japanese games. But, it was a pretty alright system. It definitely had some struggles at first, because a lot of games did not look looked inferior to they did in the 360 and the PC. But eventually they figured out how to work the damn thing, and it started getting more games because the 360 despite its strong start, ended up pissing out. Because they just decided they needed more exclusives. So yeah, that means the 360 was the final system of the three that I also bought with my own money. I did buy all three systems for myself. As a matter of fact, the DS was like one of the last systems I actually got as a gift. But the first game I bought with the 360 was Perfect Dark Zero, which I don't think was as bad as people made it out to be. I thought it was pretty okay. Definitely inferior to the original, by every way, shape, and form. The 360, because of its exclusives, started dying out. But once I'd gotten said exclusives, I pretty much use it for multiplats as well. I did not have a big library for that thing, much like with the original Xbox. You'd think I would have learned my lesson. My PS3 library is about 2 large stacks worth. Not huge, but not enough to have to justify buying the damn console. My Wii is definitely the biggest stacks of the three. And that is going to be where I give my win to. Yes, I know. It's the casual system, cry about it. But a lot of exclusive games, a lot of games that just offer different experiences, and far too many on the other consoles were just games I could get on my PC. And honestly, as I said before, I probably just use my PS3 just as much, if not more so, for backwards compatibility, because having 3 systems in one was great, even though the software rendering of PS1 games did break a few games, like Silent Hill 1. Oh, that one made me sad. Thankfully, I did find a way to work around with that game, but there are a couple of other games that just were almost unplayable, but most of them worked fine. I was sad. I nursed that PS3 to hell and back. I even went as far as to take the disk drive out and put a new one in to keep that thing alive. And when that thing finally yellow lighted to death on me, I was so sad. Ended up buying an Ultra Slim later on. Which, yeah, I know that was probably a mistake. Ugh, man, rip backwards compatible PS3s. After that, my next purchase was the Wii U, which we got after I moved to Oklahoma. And I was working as actually a caregiver. Who's pinging me so much? Seriously. Man, I just have... you'd think I'd learn to turn the pings off, but I usually don't get pinged very much. I don't know why today's something special. But anyways, the Wii U, ugh. That system was a tragedy. But I also believed it was treated unfairly. That system ended up having a bit of a Sega Saturn issue. Oh, you know what? I just realized I skipped the Dreamcast. Yeah, I bought that one for myself right before the thing got discontinued. Oh, that pissed me off. Which sucked because I mostly bought it for like the Sonic games and a few exclusives. Yeah, I know there was like some Sega games that people liked, like Power Stone, but I could never get into that game. I don't like fighting games. I'm sorry, I don't. But yeah, I had like maybe a total of 8 games for that system, and half of them were just ports of PS1 or upgraded ports of PS1 games or downgraded ports of PC games. Yeah, that was not a good lifespan, and it's really unfortunate that that ended up killing Sega because it did have some creativity to it. The VMU was an interesting design choice. It was definitely more powerful than the 64 and the PlayStation, hence why I said better ports of PlayStation games. But, you know, once the PS2 and the Cube came out, it killed it. Plus, you know, the lack of original games, or exclusive games, also killed it. As good as Sonic Shuffle and the adventure games were, it's just not enough. And that, unfortunately, just drove Sega out of the console business, for better or for worse. Real shame what happened to that system. Like, I know someone who just absolutely drools over it. Because I know they loved Crazy Taxi, which, fair, pretty fun game. That was more of something I played in the arcades, though, but that's just me. Anyways, back to the Wii U. I hate the fact that they botched the launch so badly. Between how they advertised it and the fact that it was overpriced, and the base model should not have existed. They should have just launched one model of 300, and it was the 32. That's it. And yes, have it come with Nintendo Land. Although looking back, there are probably better ways to showcase how the gamepad works, like WarioWare, or not Wario's, Wario Game & Wario. That's what it was called. Did a better job at that than Nintendo Land, probably. But Nintendo Land was a pretty good pack-in game. But anyways, if they hadn't have botched that launch so bad, it might not have just set doom for the system, which I absolutely hate. Yes, the system was underpowered. I know. Underpowered and overpriced. But I actually liked the gamepad. It was quite comfortable in my hands. I liked it when they used it for means other than just displaying the screen on a second screen. Which, because of the range of that thing, is pretty much useless unless, you know, you're just going to sit... Your dad's going to commandeer the couch, so you just turn it off and keep playing on the gamepad. Or if you just want to lay down in bed and play, which is all I use the gamepad's second screen for when it wasn't being used for other things. But when it being used for other things, I actually liked it quite a bit. Being able to use it as a quick inventory for a lot of things, like the Zelda ports, or using it as a sniper scope and Zombie U, was pretty cool. And unlike with the, because I don't know if it's the fidelity of the thing or the fact that I kept the brightness low, but unlike with the DS, I never worried about scratching it or leaving thumbprints on it because I always use my fingers when using it. Plus, I'm not having to constantly look at it. Because, you know, if I need to look down for quick inventory or raise it up for a scope, I usually not looking at it for too long. There are a lot of great games on that system. Most of them were Nintendo games, but there are also some good ports. Or third-party games like Zombie U. Now, Switch owners who did not pick up the Wii U pretty much lucked out because a lot of them were ported over, like Pokken, Captain Toad, although in that case I do prefer the Wii U version. TSM was ported, Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze was ported, we got a better version, We got 3D World, which came with an expansion pack that was ported. So, like, at least half of its good library was ported over. So you might be asking, well, why are you talking about it so much? Why do you still have it? Well, there are first of all, there are the games that weren't ported over. Like, some people might like Smash 4 for some of the content that didn't get put in Ultimate. I don't particularly care that much. There's Yoshi's Woolly World, which is an amazing game. Well, maybe not amazing, but it was quite good. But anyways, that's just a few examples. The other reason is it's backwards compatible with the Wii, and you can use an HDMI cable for it, which doesn't upscale, unfortunately, but, you know, not having to worry about playing that on Wii games on TVs that don't have that input anymore is quite nice. I was disappointed that it wasn't backwards compatible with GameCube games, but with the magic of hacking and using a program called Nintendo, it unlocks the Wii's original backwards compatibility mode, and you can play GameCube games. So you've got 3 systems in one. And since this architecture is so similar, almost all games run perfectly. Yeah, when I put my GameCube away and Wii a long time ago because I've got 3 systems in one. Because when I used to keep my Wii out for a while to play GameCube games on, and would just play Wii games on my Wii U, because the system transfer like copied everything anyway. So yeah, my Wii U may not be getting that much use for its intended purpose anymore, which is Wii U games, which I still play a few from now and then. Like, I still need to play. I'll eventually probably play Xenoblade X, but everything else I've pretty much played out. But, you know, being able to go back and play those Wii games and GameCube games is great. Like, I've been using it to play Pokemon XD and Coliseum for the first time. So that was an underappreciated and underrated console that just was treated so unfairly by both developers, consumers, and the Nintendo itself, because they put some shovelware out later in its life, like Ultra Smash. That was a piece of shit. Ugh. It really makes me sad, the fate that console had, because what it had was pretty good, and what you could do with it through hacking is just great. Now for the PS4 and the Xbox One, yeah, I have both of them. Xbox One I did not get that much use out of, because I was primarily using it for, apart from Halo and Gears, I was primarily using it for ports. And even now, like, if you want to talk about a system that gathers dust, it would be that. I pretty much use it for I use it more for 360 and Xbox backwards compatibility than I do for Xbox One games. Now, granted, I have my original Xbox hacked so I could play the games that aren't backwards compatible, but that's another issue. And as far as the PS4, it was basically the same thing with better graphics. Had some exclusives at the start, but much like how the PS5 is now, it's just losing. It just kind of lost that, and I've only got like one large stack of games worth. Well, 2 medium stacks, I guess. And I hardly ever use it as well, because I've played those games, and none of them are particularly special, at least to me. At least the ones that aren't exclusive, anyway. Because there are some good exclusives. Like, I got the Uncharted collection back before Uncharted 4 ruined the series. I guess the only other thing to talk about is the Vita. That game was also, like, had an unfortunate fate. But the problem with that system was a lot of its games, much like with the Saturn, half of them didn't come out of Japan, and Western support fizzled out after 2 years. Because it was a surprisingly powerful little system. Oh, you know, I haven't talked about the 3DS much either. But yeah, it was a surprisingly powerful little system. And through hacking, you can gain full backwards compatibility with the PSP, which is good because my PSP actually had the screen shatter once because it fell down some stairs. Do not ask me how that happened. That's an embarrassing story. Because I had a hole in my pocket, and the rest is history. Official support, unfortunately, was not only like less than half the library, but it did have some good experiences, and you can do a lot with it through hacking. So I recommend it. I do recommend picking one up for the ability to. Oh, my screen just shut off. My ability to, or the ability to play said games. But if you're just looking for exclusive experiences, or just for the Vita itself, yeah, probably not a great thing, because even then, some of the games have been ported off or updated, like Demon Gaze. And then the 3DS, I can apply most of what I said for the DS. I love the system, mostly because of the hacking. It's got some pretty good games on it, not nearly as much as the DS. But yeah, it had an unfortunate end of its life, where it just, much like with the Wii U, just fizzled out at the end. But again, it had some pretty good games throughout its life. It had a bad start, bad end, but the middle of its life, pretty good. And with hacking, like I said, you've got 4 handhelds in one. And honestly, I like the 3D effect of it. I don't get a head. Maybe it's because I don't get a headache from it, unlike with VR. So maybe that's why I like it, but I really wish they had expanded more upon glasses-free 3D, because it's quite nice. It's just a shame that the area which you have to look at is so small. But as for winners for that generation, for the handheld, definitely the 3DS. My favorite, it's my favorite handheld altogether anyway, but again, that's mostly because of the hacking. And because I also have a hacked Do 3DS XL, which has better form factor, and that larger screen, once you get used to it, is quite nice. And for the consoles, I'm going to have to give it for the Wii U. And before you jump me, let me explain why. Yes, part of it's because of the hacking, but also because it's the only system, the console, that really felt like a console still. Because here's the thing with the 3DS and the Bone. You know what's great about console gaming? The fact that you could just plug it and play. You can do that with the Wii U for the most part. Yeah, some games do have patches, but not a lot of them, and most of the patches aren't big. For almost everything for the Bone and the PS4, you have to plug it in and first install it, which takes up a bunch of space. And then you usually have some day one patch that's big. And then you have to go through firmware updates, which, yes, the Wii U had as well, but not a lot. And then there's like games that are just broken without said day one patch, games that aren't on the disc. Way more digital only games. So it's just like, what is the point of having this over a PC? Just answer me that. What was the point of having that over the PC? Primarily the reason I even keep these two around is because of the few exclusives it does get, and because of games that like are kind of shitty on PC, either because of DRM or it's just a bad port. So honestly, that would be the only reason to even pick those two up over a Wii U, is unless you just want those Sony exclusives, is for that ability to do that. But again, this is where console gaming stopped becoming console gaming to me, because that ease of use and plug and play is gone. This is also why I never picked up a PS4 or Series X, and well, I might sometime. I have even less reason to now, because both of them are losing their exclusives. And both of them are even less, feel less like a console. They feel like mini PCs. So why bother? Which brings me to the Switch. Not only yes, it does have patches. Yes, you do have to install a little bit of data for some physical games, but it's quick usually. And it's simple. You plug it in, it'll automatically download the patch and you go. Or if there is no patch, you can start it immediately. And most of those games, apart from like a few, like the Spyro trilogy, you don't even need to download the patch. You can just play them off the get-go. So yeah, Wii U wins the last one for that alone, as well as for the hacking. And yes, I know the sales. You're gonna say, "Well, the sales the other way." I don't care. I do not care. I'm not a Nintendo investor. I got way more use out of that thing than the PS4 or the Bone, and I appreciate the gimmicks it has. So cry about it. And I'm gonna save you the trouble right now. Yeah, I do think the haptic feedback triggers in the PS5 are kind of interesting, but guess what? The Switch wins it as well. Why? Because it created the hybrid thing. And you can't tell me that that wasn't just a gimmick, because the Steam Deck is a thing, and then there's all these, like, hybrid mini PCs coming out. Now, its library is pretty hit and miss, I will admit, even both from Nintendo and for third-party games. But damn, if you got a lot of indie games to choose from, as well as niche Japanese games that are all in that system, because that's the only place you get the damn thing uncensored. Thanks, Sony. Yeah. I don't know what else to say about it. The Switch, in that regards, it's got my biggest library to date. Yeah, I know the system is weak and underpowered, which kills some games, or kept some games off of it completely, which is unfortunate. I really wish Nintendo either hadn't done that, or they'd gotten the Switch 2 out sooner. I'm hoping that they learn from that, and now that they know the hybrid method will sell, that the Switch 2 is like, you know, something that will get more third-party games in the system, just so I don't have to buy a PS4 or a Series X to play PC games that have shitty PC ports, or, you know, didn't get a PC port for whatever reason. But that's my rant on how console gaming are these days. The only other thing I can really touch of is the Virtual Boy and VR in general. Never had a Virtual Boy, only played it a couple times in a demo shop. It's as bad as people make it out to be. There are a couple of good games, which are Wario Land and the Jack Brothers game, but that's like 2 or 3 games out of 10. I'm not even getting into the game because get into that too much, because like I don't know how well it would have done even if Nintendo had released the proper head strap and not gave it that ugly red and black monochrome that hurt people's head. That's one thing. Well, I will not disagree with the mainstream opinion on, because that system was not good. And VR in general, I hate how it's being treated as a gimmick still, because of the small install base. Because once you sit down and play VR, the immersion level is something I've always wanted from games, modern games. Being able to interact and having that Wiimote-like aiming for shooting is great. Stereoscopic 3D is great, although since it's not technically glasses 3D anymore, it can give me a headache through prolonged use. I will say that's not a problem, as is the motion sickness. But if you're having motion sickness, a little tip: take some Dramamine. It helps. But that's pretty much my journey through the video game land. I have played some offshot console games like CDI. Or not CDI and the 3DO, but that's either through demo stations or emulation. I don't know what else to say other than the future is both good and bad. Nintendo's doing some really dumb shit from their legal department, but the Switch has given us a lot of hope. They still make good games, although they still make some disappointing ones. Like, most people don't like the new Pokemon games. Though that's more Games Freak problem, and the cycle of Pokemon's problem. A lot of people don't like the modern Mario sports games, which I will agree with Tennis and Strikers, but I thought the golf one was pretty good. You know, Mario Odyssey was pretty good, although it's not my favorite of the series. They did take Zelda in a direction I don't like, but Breath of the Wild was a solid game. So I think this future's still pretty good on the Nintendo front. We'll have to see how the Switch 2 does. For Sony and Microsoft, I think it's better off they just exit and become publishers, because the idealism of having a console is lost on both of them, and the fact that they're doing very little for video game preservation. Through the Series X killing its backwards compatibility, and the PS5 only having backwards compatibility with the 4. I think it's just... I know this is like gonna come off as like Nintendo fanboyism, but like, let's be real, the Switch is the only console worth owning. Ooh, you can just emulate. I don't care. I've kind of learned that I kind of prefer having the original experiences as close as possible. That's why I don't really do modding as much as I used to. Man, I used to play like Half-Life mods quite a bit, but that was often more like when I do mods, I prefer more like, unless it's fixing a serious glaring issue, I prefer like community expansions, like new levels and stuff. Now, I know I didn't really talk too much about my PC gaming, which, you know, I've played a lot of stuff on it. I still spend most of my time, more time on it, unless I'm playing Nintendo stuff. But, you know, PC gaming is PC gaming, and I'm kind of glad it's kind of made kind of a comeback. But, yeah, that's my view on things. Maybe the next Xbox or PlayStation will wow us. They'll go back to being more plug-and-play accessible, or maybe they'll just be less draconian with the censorship, or maybe they'll actually start working on proper video game preservation. Like, shit, if the PS6 is, like, backwards compatible with everything, I'd get it in a heartbeat. But anyways, I hope you hear this, like, 36-year-old man's retrospective on the industry and what I consider the best and worst in the consoling. Psychedelic Maze out.